Welcome to Chapter 2 of the Frontiersmen. We're going to go straight in. Titus and I have had a few practice rounds, but I'm really pumped. This is a really action-packed chapter. It's going to have some pivotal moments that are going to essentially launch us into the frontier war, the wilderness war. And we've titled this Blood Brothers and Battlefields, a ledger. If you're watching on YouTube or Substack, getting first access to this before it comes out on YouTube. If you're listening to it on the podcast, then go and subscribe to our Substack. If you're not already there, if you want to check out the visuals, we've put together some cool stuff for you guys. Going straight into the narrative, we have here this warfare that is kicking off between the whites and between the Indians. And right away, I'm going to give Titus the floor to dispel some of the common myths. We've already alluded to this being important for the story as a whole. But essentially, the lack of unity, the deviousness, and the treaty violations and the double standard that the Indians have, in this chapter, it's going to lead to some pretty significant conflicts. So with that, Titus, give us some of your perspective on a lot of the common tropes that we hear, like, this was land that was already pre-owned and we stole it and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So we have the main thing to talk about here is this Kentucky land. So I think part of where we get the name for the state of Kentucky from is this region, which is a sacred hunting ground. Rumored, spirits live on this land. They're cursed people that died. Anyone who would settle on this land is cursed. And this mythology around this is kind of actually the only thing that really kept it being an organized and agreed upon thing, even for the Indians, that, hey, we don't settle in here. We don't live with this. This is a hunting preserve for us. But this was not a sentiment that was shared by the white settlers. So they're coming in and they're trying to really, in my view, exercise the Dominion mandate to cultivate and to grow a society that allows for all to flourish, because they don't worship creation, they worship the creator. And so as we worship the creator, he's given us these rules and these commands that we're supposed to go out to beautify, to cultivate, and to work it. Whereas the Indians, they worship the creator, or not the creator, they worship the creation rather. And because of this, they are, treating the land in a way that I don't believe it was meant to be treated. We're not Buddhists. We don't believe that all parts of creation are inherently, all spirits are imbued with the same imago Dei that we have. Christians believe differently than this. So there's this conflict in both people groups and also in ideologies here over this hunting ground. And then there's also the differences between the cultures of the settlers and the cultures of the Indians as we move into that. And we'll touch on that a little bit more in the next slide, with basically the white people being a cohesive unit with shared values, shared common laws coming from a common place, versus the Indians, who were in close to 100 different tribes that were loosely related to each other, but definitely still separate. And this causes a lot of blame shifting and differences in opinion on what treaties are valid, how treaties can be upheld, who has the authority to make treaties, and all that, and really leads to a lot of the conflict that we find, particularly in the beginning of this chapter 2.
The tribes that we're dealing with here are tribes that have moved in and on each other's land from other areas. We mentioned that a little bit before. There are tribes that come as far as Florida. These are people that in some cases were pushed out by settlers. We have to remember again that Americans have been in this land for over 100 years, which is why they're about to fight the British for ownership of it. And we actually see in this chapter too, the Americans dealing with broken treaties and devious behavior, not only from the British, particularly the governor of the Virginia territory, the West Virginia territory, but also the Indians as well. And to add to Titus's point, what the white settlers are doing, because they come from hundreds of years, if not longer, but certainly hundreds of years of common law practice and how you claim land, who has ownership of it. We can go back to the feudal system. Because they're coming with that mindset and they've already established that in the east coast of the country, they're coming into this area with a certain mode of operation, bringing order to it. They're marking their land. That's an important aspect of the tomahawk. It's used by our main character and others to etch out areas that are theirs. And when they're coming, as Titus said, they're coming to to subdue the land and to make it fruitful. They wanted to set up settlements where they can then hunt the land around it and cultivate that land. And they do a phenomenal job at this wherever they go. This is why America has become such a promised land and also coveted by the British Parliament, using the king to exploit the colonials who were subjects because the land is being so well run by them. So even you have Simon Kenton, his family. Sorry, I put a knickknack in my mouth. Kenton, you have his family on a tobacco farm, coming and making use of the land. And so the settlers, as they push west, are just automatically doing this. Whereas the Indians, they have this hunter gatherer mentality, and that's something that I've talked about on the regular nutrition podcast, Be Regenerated, where this hunter gatherer mindset is never one in human history that leads to civilizational flourish and actually leads to peace. It's the use of the land, the cultivating of the land, making the land produce more than the people are consuming so that they have something to trade with. And what the Indians are trading with is really their subsistence living materials. And that's why they have to very violently repulse any types of settlers that come into the land, because they're going to use the land differently and they're going to take dominion of it. Whereas the Indians had basically loose treaties with each other to not have individual ownership of this land because there's so many different tribes. We mentioned that there are 4 sub tribes of just the one main tribe in this book, the Shawnees, and even they can't agree. Their leaders aren't in agreement. You have these 2 different mindsets. So the Native American view is dismissive of each other. They're dismissive of each other's claims often, but they have minor infractions and broken agreements and treaties. Sometimes they have practices that we'll see later in the book that are very violent towards each other and are really terrible, like burning people alive for even minor things. And we see that come into play later in the book that shows a lot of the character of their pagan culture. And of course, that's something that Tecumseh doesn't like, which is one of the things that makes him a good character in the book, is he doesn't like a lot of their pagan practices and he wants to move away from it. But it's very difficult to do that because they're so decentralized and they just carry on these bad practices with each other. And they're going to escalate that with the whites to a significant degree. So whenever the white settlers violate the same things that they would be more lax with each other, they're going to impose severe punishments, acting as if this is how they normally are. So any white settler that breaks a treaty that could have been made with a completely different settlement, because these are small groups scattered along the frontier, the Indians could have made a pact with another group, and they're just going to assume that all the whites know this and that they're communicating with each other when they don't even do that themselves. So, regardless of the specific contingents, they're going to basically hold all of the whites in contempt for any violations of this. Is what we see in this chapter. So, the white mentality was that you have decentralized tribal structures that are really difficult to work with, and it makes treaties impossible to universally enforce, which is the white mindset. Even coming from British rule, there's universal enforcement. We even see the main character working for the British governor of the West Virginia Territory, and he still has to hold to his agreement that he's made with this guy, even though they don't like what the British are doing. And ultimately, they're going to, in the War for Independence, they're going to have this slow buildup to what we have in the Declaration for Independence. It's a written code of saying, after many different workings with the king and the parliament, saying this, you're violating your covenant that you've made with us as American colonials. And because you're violating that covenant, we are therefore not only permitted, but obligated to rebel against your rule because your authority is derived from this constitution or this covenant that you have as the king with your subjects. The Indians don't have anything like that. So while the settlers are coming in and not only bringing order to the land, they're bringing an ordered mindset from, again, hundreds in more, many centuries that has been ingrained in their culture. So this is where we talk about you have 2 different cultures that are destined to collapse. And because they can't enforce these treaties, that renders any small agreements that they have fundamentally doomed to make peace successful, even though there are elements where there's peaceful trade. And we even see in this, there's a group of Shawnees that has a white guy with them, and they trade with other traders and trappers because that's the way that the Indians normally are operating. And so on occasion, they do have small groups of whites they don't see as a threat because they're alone or they're a small party that are just coming to do the same thing as them. But then whenever they start to see these settlements and these forts pop up, they're like, okay, we have to now start escalating how violent we're going to be towards them to discourage them from settling the land. Is that a good assessment, Titus?
Yeah, so the first real story that we open with in chapter 2 is where we left off in chapter 1. He had gone down the river with 2 characters, John Yeager and George Strader. They were going down in search of the Cane land, this Kentucky land, but they haven't actually found what is technically officially this land yet. They're in search of it. And the character that Cameron just mentioned, this white guy, is actually a Frenchman by the name of Peter Lorimy. He gives them directions on, oh, no, you missed it. This is actually where you want to go, and told them some of the landmarks that they mistook and things like that. But they are already established in a camp, and they've actually been doing quite well for themselves trapping, and they decided to just get all they can. This is, I believe, around the time frame of March. So it's not warm. Travel's not super great, especially on the water at this time of year. Decided let's get all we can. We're doing really really well with the pelt trapping, all the furs, and we'll just take it back up to Provence settlement. We can sell it for good money, and then we'll come back down on our next trip and we'll try to find out where these cane lands are. As they are settling in for the night, the weather has shifted. Big blanket of snow has just fallen. Everything is kind of that, for those people who are familiar with Ohio, that nasty, you know, February, March, April weather where it can be, 70 one day and then like rain for a week and then drop into snow and then back to 80 degrees. We're actually kind of in that weather right now here. So very familiar with that right now. And they're soaking wet. They're chilled to the bone. They go and they kind of huddle in their little half face shelter they've made. And because they're only traveling with one set of clothes, they've stripped everything down. They're drying everything out, trying to, hang it by the fire to get dry over the night so they can have dry clothes. They don't freeze to death. In the midst of this, they are ambushed by a group of Indians, and George Strader and Simon Kenton flee. There's not time to grab literally one single thing. They're both barefoot and naked, and they flee into the woods. Unfortunately, the older gentleman, John Yeager, who had been with Indians as a boy, who actually spoke their tongue, he saw them as well, and he tried to jump up and reason with them. These Indians were not here to talk. They tomahawked him immediately, and that was the last thing that Simon saw before he fled into the woods. They had a pre-established rendezvous point, and so he was hoping that Strader had made it away as well. He didn't exactly know, stumbling around in the dark, getting cut up, banged up, bruised, all that. They end up making it to their rendezvous point. Strader did make it there as well, and they basically run through the night, but trying to rest when they can. But the temperatures and the freezing rain and all that mean that they die if they stop for too long. So just on and on and on, just running, falling, slipping, getting cut up by brambles and bushes and sticks and rocks and everything imaginable. Eventually, sun rises the next morning, and they finally see the Ohio River, stumble out onto the edge of the river, and to their surprise and relief, there is a group of 3 canoes pulled up on the beach there, and it's a group of white guys. The white guys jump up. Simon starts moving towards them. Strader just passes out completely from exhaustion, terror, the whole 9 yards on the beach. And Simon is basically, he collapses as well and is caught by a guy who asks the rest of the party, "Hey, do you know these guys?" To which Jacob Greathouse, one of the other guys in the party, replies, "Yeah, we do know this guy." And he kind of gives a little bit of a foreshadowing remark. "Yeah, I think before too long, everybody knows about this guy." And it is indeed the Greathouse party, Bill Grills, the Mann brothers, another man, and Jacob Greathouse himself, who we had met in chapter 1, happened to be on the banks, and in God's providence, he allowed them to be there, and they save George Strader and Simon Kenton.
Yeah, this is the character that we met in chapter 1 who almost killed Simon Kenton, but then essentially takes him under his wing. Now, his primary mentor who introduced him to this great house party that they had afterwards parted ways with, Jake Yeager, he was just killed. And so this is another crucible that Simon's going through. And he's going to go through so many in this book where, as Titus mentioned, imagine being in really cold conditions without any shoes, definitely going through some snow, your mud, this is thick forest, and not having a weapon. So it's a miracle that either of these guys survives. And then, and again, a stroke of God's providence, as Titus just mentioned. So very difficult part of the book. Now, here we're going to talk briefly about the tomahawk because this is quickly becoming an essential tool for these guys. It's basically their fast action weapon. They can throw it, they can hatchet somebody. This is a really important tool for the frontier. So actually, Titus is going to show us his tomahawk, the tomahawk and the knife. That's pretty awesome. I really want to come there now and do some tomahawk throwing with you. And you also have a knife from the period too, as well, right?
Yeah, this knife is not exactly what one of the frontiersmen would have had. This is from the 17th, but it would have been more of a dress knife, something that somebody maybe in one of the cities would have worn. I thought it was really cool, and I bought this with my own money when I was like 12. But I
Wow.
found it at a little shop as a guy who was selling period knives, and he's like, "This one's actually from the 1770s. Cost me a good bit of money, all of my 12-year-old savings at the time, but it was worth it for me at the time." And so I have
Heck
my
yeah.
little trinket from the War for Independence era.
Pretty rad family heirloom there. I dig it.
Yeah, and the tomahawk is, like we mentioned, it's a technological improvement over a lot of the tools. And one of the things that is cool to note about the tomahawk here is that the Indians had them, but they didn't necessarily have all the capabilities of metalworking like the settlers did. So a lot of theirs would have been bone, would have been stone, different things like that. But with the white settlers seeing how proficient these could be, they decided, oh, we have axes, we can make tomahawks. And this became one of the things that traded with the Indians a lot. So the Indians really wanted these steel tomahawks, and they really took the dominion that we've exercised, and they stepped up this tool to another level. And there's lots of different variants. The one we have on the screen, there's more of the pipe tomahawk style. The one that I have is more of a Norse adaptation. The blade shape is not necessarily the same as what would have been back in that day. It's got dirt all over it because I actually use this quite regularly, but it's a tool that would have definitely taken some getting used to, some skill, but in the right hands, when you've gained some proficiency with it, it it's truly a devastating tool, and you can get a lot of work done if you understand the different ways it can be used to leverage as both a tool and as a weapon. Definitely a formidable tool in that day.
Awesome. Yeah, so that's a little bit about the tomahawk. We're going to shift now into where Simon's at in his journey. He is becoming really well known on the frontier because of his skills, even though he goes through this situation where, again, I'm without my weapon, I'm about to die. But that's why the guys in their party vouch for him when they're helpless and they need, and it's a risk for them to take them on. So what's happening in this chapter is he's becoming famous, and being a legend not only makes him a target of the Indians, but also makes him a desirable person for the settlers to seek out after. And we have to remember why he's out here. He ran away. He wants to be obscure. He's running under the name Simon Butler, and no one knows that he's Simon Kenton. He doesn't reveal his true name till way later on in the book. So at this point, he's still living under his persona as Simon Butler, essentially a man on the run, but he's becoming a valuable man because of his ability to survive. And I think the testimony of him surviving this particular crucible where he's alone and on his own, in addition to God's providence, is also his grit as a man, which is really cool. So he's trying to move around unseen. This is his physical prowess. And now what happens is he meets another character in the book, also named Simon. This is a guy named Simon Gertie, and he saves his life. Return for him saving his life, they form a blood brother pact that's initiated by Simon Gertie. Simon Gertie is a guy who we will also trace his arc throughout the book. It's tragic as well. We can see why he makes the decisions that he does. Ultimately, he doesn't land on the right side, but this pact is going to come into play later on in the book and be really important. So Simon doesn't know the outcome. He's just doing what a good man would do in saving this guy's life. And eventually, Simon's going to attempt to save his life at a really crucial point later on in the book. And so we see this pact play an important role in their relationship. And ultimately, Simon is going to honor this pact. And one of the cool analogies I wanted to bring in was the relationship between, we're trying to tie this in with biblical arcs as well, biblical narratives. We have the pact that's made between David and Jonathan. Remember, David is on the run from King Saul. He's a marked man, and he's got guys coming around him because of his skill, because he's a very formidable warrior, so very much like Simon Kenton. And in that story, Jonathan makes a pact with David, and their friendship is massive. And we don't see Jonathan violate God's law by dishonoring his father. Jonathan continues to fight for and honor his father, but when his father is trying to kill an innocent man, someone that he's made a pact with, we see Jonathan save David's life and put his life on the line multiple times by speaking up on David's behalf to his father, even putting his life on the line when he goes into battle and his father almost kills him. So we see that Saul is a very devious character and is constantly violating treaties and pacts. And that's important because this is exactly what's going on here in our book. We shouldn't be surprised when we see history repeat itself in our times. And we've got these biblical narratives that we can lean on, and we can see a lot of the same things. And that plays into a larger point that we wanted to make in this chapter and then throughout the book as we go. There are individual acts of vengeance, of violence, and also of heroism that determine long-term destinies and determine the course of the war itself. So that's important. And again, this relationship between them is going to come into play. Do you want to detail a little bit more about that particular encounter that they have and how he saves his life, Titus?
Sure. So after Simon is rescued by the Great House Party, they go back upriver to the Provence settlement where he kind of splits away from the Great House Party. They go off on another mission down the river. I don't even remember exactly where they went, but it wasn't really important to the story at that time. He recovers, and then he kind of gets back on his feet and is looking for what's the next move. And he comes across this character, Simon Gertie, who is being roughed up by basically a British soldier, and he is being accused of being a quote Indian lover, of having affections for the Indians, whether they be romantic or just like not thinking they are what the rest of the settlers think they are, not calling them savages, and they think he's a traitor. And he's being definitely beaten badly. It's kind of unclear what's going to happen, what intentions he has. But Simon steps up. Kind of Simon's MO is becoming more and more to be the hero. It's a natural instinct that God's given him. So he steps in and kind of catches the redcoat flat-footed and ends up saving Simon Gertie. And his notoriety does save him in this case a little bit because people do know who he is, and it kind of strikes a little bit of fear into the soldiers. They make their blustering threats, but eventually he gets Gertie gets let go, and he goes with Simon. And Simon kind of tries to walk away and say, "Okay, good deed done. I'm going to move on." And then Gertie's like, "Well, hey, you saved my life. You should, wants to talk to him." And they end up taking a liking to each other. And then Gertie recommends that they do this pact, this blood brother oath, the traditional cut the palms, let the blood go together, the whole thing which he's learned from the Native Americans. And he does confess to Simon that, like, yeah, I don't think the Indians are as bad as a lot of people make them out to be. He doesn't have quite as much of an animus toward them as others, which will become very apparent as the story goes on farther on in the different actions and the different paths that both the guys take. But that was kind of the story between him and Simon Gertie. He did save his life, most likely. It's not the most crazy, heroic story, but it definitely took a lot of courage for him to do that. And then that would kind of lead us on out of that to what was the next step for Simon.
There we go. Okay. So now we have this interaction that they're having with Lord Dunmore, who is the governor of West Virginia. He's the British, he's the British consulate, basically, the governor of that area. So he's not an American, he's a Brit. The Americans don't like him because he's acting on the interests of the crown and not the interests of the people there. So this is where we mentioned that the Americans have two enemies at this point. They have the greatest empire in the world, who is trying to run roughshod over them and tell them how to settle their land and what they can get in return. This is going to lead to the war for independence, which is right on the cusp of that. And what Simon has, because he knows the land, because he can get from place to place, he's been recruited as a message runner. So he's a messenger to get messages from the governor of the territory, who really is, again, because his interests are for the crown, he's not looking out for the settlers who are dealing with hostile Indians and trying to bring order to the land. And he doesn't really care about that. So he's just thinking, all right, who do we have to fight? Who do we have to keep control? And so he's in a difficult situation. And Simon is a messenger. He takes on this job. And Dunmore's goal is to undermine the rising independent militia leaders. So the Americans are uniting, and they're not only uniting against the British on the eastern front, but then they're uniting against the Indians on the western front, which is really cool. And the issue here is that Simon is essential. Without getting messages at this time, a foot runner had to do it through these lands. You couldn't just take a horse across all of it. Simon was really fast. He had a lot of endurance. We've talked about this a little bit. And so he is absolutely essential in a really dangerous area to making sure the messages can actually get through. One of my favorite scenes in the book, there's the book. If you haven't read it, it's another phenomenal book, obviously set in the French and Indian War, but The Last of the Mohicans. So you can kind of think of Simon like one of those colonial guys or the Mohicans in how good he is at navigating this territory, how quickly he's become essential for the survival of people, to where even the governor of the region is relying on him. And in this area, we're about to hit a major battle, our first major battle of the book. And George Rogers Clark emerges as the militia captain in the area. And of course, Dunmore doesn't like Clark because he is the leader of the American militia. Now, Clark's focus is certainly, his sympathies are with the American cause, but he's also responsible for the survival of the people and their fort that they're at on the frontier. And so he's dealing with the Indians. And that's where we see here the British not only not being able to take good care of the colonials that they're supposed to be in charge of, but then he's also not taking good care of his leaders in the area who are trying to fend off the hostile Indians, who at this point the Americans and the British should be in unity against, in order to be able to move west and take more territory for the British Empire. So it's a really important area. And George Rogers Clark is one of my favorite characters in the book. And he's a nobleman. The people see him as a natural leader. He's older than Kenton. He's more experienced in battle than Kenton, and he's about to prove his worth on the battlefield.
Yeah, and as we come up to this battle, we can look at the factors that lead into this. So we have a couple of other characters who are not as much in this story main characters, but at the time they would have been notable characters, namely Chief Logan. Chief Logan is a chief of the Shawnee Indians. He's one of their principal chiefs, and he has always been peaceful towards the white men. He has always refused to lift his hand against them. He's actually been one of the main voices keeping certain tribes, when they wanted to go to war with the whites, from doing so. And there are other tribes who are more hostile, and there's hostilities brewing for sure in the background, but Logan is still determined to keep the peace and to not to fight with them. But not all actors in this area and in this time were pure actors. And as we've already mentioned, the CD characters of the Mann brothers and Jacob Greathouse, they come into to play here big time. They are heading back down the river after they've dropped Simon at Provence settlement, and they are definitely bloodthirsty characters, and they have blood on the mind. They know that something is probably going to kick off with Lord Dunmore raising an army to try to keep, like, as a peacekeeping force, which inevitably is going to end in conflict. So in their minds, the war is probably going to kick off soon, maybe, and so they have license to do whatever they want. And again, there's no formal law in these parts. They're just kind of rogue actors. What ends up happening is they lure some of the people of Loganstown over to their camp. Basically, they do this under pretenses of, let's have a good time, let's drink some whiskey, let's have a marksmanship competition. But they lure a small contingent over because Logan declines to come because he and his village were actually going to be going on a journey the next day. But they said, we'll send a group over to enjoy the night with you guys. Well, Greathouse has other plans, and after everybody is a little bit intoxicated, they have their marksmanship competition, and after the Indians have gone first and fired their guns, the rest of Greathouse's party emerges from the shadows and they start shooting all of them down. It's a bloodbath. They massacre pretty much all the Indians, except I believe one straggler might get away in diving into the river and swimming injured back to the other side. But who they do end up killing is both the son and the son-in-law and the daughter of Chief Logan. He sent his family members across as a token of good faith, and these men, acting extremely wickedly, killed them all. You can read the book and get the full account of that, but he kills these three individuals, and the daughter of Chief Logan was also with child at the time. And so there's that fourth life lost. And they don't just shoot them, they do it and they massacre and they mutilate bodies in a horrible and gruesome way. Extremely uncivilized, extremely degenerate behavior. And this kind of is the catalyst that kicks off the war, and that changes Chief Logan from the constant peacekeeper of the area to a force for war, and spurs on the battle that we'll talk about in a moment with George Rogers Clark, and where his mettle is really, really tested there. An interesting side note, too, the biggest friend that Simon had of that group, Bill Grills, who kind of had a distaste for the violence of the Mann brothers and Greathouse. He does not participate in the shooting. He was the only voice of dissent when they hatched their plot, and as they're getting ready to enact their plan, he slips off into the shadows and he disappears from the frontier. He's had enough and he leaves. So with that, he kind of preserves what was left of his reputation, what little there was after associating with Greathouse for that much time.
Yeah, which is interesting because he's the guy that originally brought Simon into contact with the Great House Party, and these are bad characters. So yeah, really sad part of the book, and an example that we talked about earlier, that there are good and bad actors on both sides, and so this is going to lead to the climax of this chapter and the first major battle, which is the Battle of Point Pleasant. So this act of vengeance by a group of bad characters. Again, we could see there's other biblical analogies of this. If you think of like the skirmish with the Benjamites in the Book of Judges, that's a parallel here. And so now what's going to happen is Lord Dunmore's forces, who are the militiamen and the British, and then with George Rogers Clark being over the militiamen, this is going to be the time where they prove themselves. And the militiamen under George Rogers Clark, and particularly him in the battle, that's where he gets set up as their leader. That's Men are going to come to respect him, and he's going to be the one that they look to for leadership over the British at this point because of his acts of valor in this battle, and because they win it, even though the Shawnee put up a very fierce fight. It's a really gruesome battle, and it marks a significant turning point in the book. Do you want to detail some of that, Titus?
Yeah, so this battle is one of the first accounts really of a large scale force in this area doing combat with the Indians. There's been lots of little small skirmishes, but most of them are in the form of ambushes. This is the first one, and for sure in the book, this is the first example we have of we know they're coming, they know we know they're coming, and we're going to kind of do battle in this wooded area. And the kind of the interesting twist of this whole battle is the conflict between George Rogers Clark and Lord Dunmore. Lord Dunmore is actually actively trying to undermine George Rogers Clark. He doesn't like him. And while he is using the militia, because that's what he has at his disposal, he doesn't have a bunch of troops. So he's bolstering his regulars, his British regulars, with the militia. But he kind of wants to sweep in and get the credit for saving the day. And he really would love it if George Rogers Clark goes down in the battle, or at least has his reputation tarnished as somebody who can't follow orders or led his men into a bad spot. So Dunmore is actively giving Clark bad instructions, and this is done through Kenton. Kenton is the messenger who's running through enemy lines to deliver these, and people essentially, Clark and Dunmore, they can't believe that Kenton is as fast and as durable as he is. He's delivering these messages, and there's even an instance of them sending another runner to get confirmation of the message, who takes like twice as long as Kenton does, because they're like, no, you didn't make it all the way back to Dunmore or back to Clark. You didn't get the message straight. You're just making something up so you didn't have to do it. They couldn't actually believe he did it as fast and as skillfully as he did. But it becomes clear because of this speed of Kenton, George Rogers Clark is able to clue into the fact that Dunmore is setting him up. But the damage is to some extent done already. So he sets his men up and decides we're going to make our best stand we possibly can. They find themselves on Point Pleasant. So that's why we call this the Battle of Point Pleasant. It's an area where a triangular piece of land juts into the river. So they can kind of have the river on two sides of their back and form a line to where, unless the Indians do some maneuver across the Ohio in a canoe, they can kind of fight the battle on one side versus being encircled. So this battle ensues, and it is not a walkover for either side. It is a fierce, hard fought battle. Many people die in this battle. Lots of just gory bloodshed, ranging from arrows and muskets being fired at range, all the way up to the lines closing and there being knives and tomahawks used. Scalps are taken, the whole 9 yards. It is extremely bloody, extremely gruesome. It happens in several waves of things cool down and they heat up, and they cool down and they heat up. Kind of people regrouping and recharging again and fighting, with Clark's men doing their best to hold their ground as they desperately wait for some other reinforcement or the other contingent of Clark's colonial army, or his militiamen rather, to come in from the other side and give them reinforcements.
Really cool part of the book. Definitely you need to read it or listen to it and get all the details. That's one of the cool things about this book is it gives a lot of details of the battle. It's a book chronicling from one battle to the next where there's this really brutal warfare, and the militiamen are skilled with the rifle. At this point the Indians are also using the rifle, so they're pretty much evenly matched in the sense of their weaponry and their tools. But because the militiamen have the training and the British training of firing in lines, they're able to hold their ground against the people who knew the land better than them and should have had even more reinforcements had the Indians banded together. So I think one of the things that the Indians learn out of this is that they can't just count on them being the original masters of the land. At this point, the frontiersmen are matching them and are going to quickly take over. And so that's why it's significantly escalating at this point in the book. Now, the next thing that we wanted to share are a couple key character moments that are really tragic. And so this is after the Battle of Point Pleasant. And what happens, what really the culmination of this time is you have one guy, James Ward, sorry, and in the chaos of the battle, he is killed by his son, who was stolen by the Indians. The Indians, there's all kinds of accounts of this throughout the history of our dealings with the natives, but they had taken his son when he was younger, and he's an Indian at this point. They've assimilated him into the tribe, and this was sometimes they would do this with their captives, and it's really sad because this man is killed by his own son in this battle, and this just goes to show the nature of the times that they were living in. So that's a tragic arc. And there's going to be another one that happens later in the book that's even more tragic. And then we also have the death of Chief Puxinwa, who is Tecumseh's father. So there's our other main character of the book. And he actually dies in the arms of his wife. and his young son is orphaned at that point. So that's also going to mark the destiny of our other main character when his father is killed in battle with the whites. So these are deeply personal losses on both sides. And both of these, because the word gets out, the Indians now know, okay, our great Puxinwa, who we had mentioned earlier, is not the primary chief of the Shawnees. He's just the great man of his tribe, which is one of the lesser tribes that wasn't the leading tribe of the Shawnees. And that's going to further cement Tecumseh's legacy and is going to put him in the spotlight. Then we also have on the white side this tragedy where they hear that, man, this guy was killed by his own son whom the Indians had taken captive. So it's just going to stoke more seeds of vengeance, and it's going to dictate the next 40 years of this frontier warfare history. And then we want to close this chapter that happened with the Battle of Point Pleasant and talk about a few things to bring it all together. So we have Simon Kenton, the main character. He's a survivor not only of an ambush of Indians and then of this battle, being a runner behind enemy lines and really leading to their success by his ability to get through really quickly, as Titus mentioned. We also have Simon Gertie, who is in between two worlds, and he's got a relationship with Simon Kenton, but ultimately he's going to be on the side of the Indians as the book goes on. He doesn't necessarily fight in open warfare in this battle against the whites. He's not seen as an Indian by the Indians, but he's a lone actor that's looking out really for his best interests, and he can see he's looking at these tragedies on both sides as well, and ultimately he's going to believe that the Indians are the ones that are being wronged. And of course, as we mentioned, even in this story, there are really significant acts of wickedness that you can see why people might have taken that position, even men like Bill Grills who were there. And then we've got George Rogers Clark, who's a rising commander of the Frontiersmen, and he's going to be a really pivotal leader going on forward and very important for the Americans and our survival as a nation later on. And then we have Tecumseh, who's now a fatherless heir to his tribe. And remember, he's already had that prophecy over him because of the shooting star that it's not come to light yet, but this is an important part of his character arc. And then the culmination of broken treaties, the Great House Massacre of Chief Logan's family, and then this disputed Kentucky land has led to this battle. And I love this picture of an anvil really showing all of the force coming down is now launching us into this frontier war. And the era of neutral hunting grounds is now gone. So the settlers, they have already had a hard time, but they're not going to be able to just hunt this land. They're going to have to fight for it, and they're going to have to conquer it if they want to keep it. And then the same thing with the Indians. And the era of bloodshed has now begun at this point in the book. It's officially in full swing. So that's essentially the ending of chapter 2. We have 11 more chapters to go in this book, and it's already getting really action packed from the very beginning. This is why you need to read it and why we want to discuss it with you. We are doing a bi weekly X Space where we're jumping on, and members of our Brotherhood who are reading this book can contribute to the discussion. And if you want to dive a little bit more into some of the application of this, that's what we're really trying to do on the X Space, because right now our country's at war. And it's important to understand that even though there may be one man in charge, we have our opinions as observers, particularly in this day and age where we can get a lot of information from the ground pretty quickly over platforms like X. And we tend to think of things in really broad sweeps and make a lot of determinations when on the ground there are a lot of actions happening by individual actors that we don't have control over. Even the president doesn't have control over. And these are the types of things that lead to multi-generational bloodshed and feuds happening. The things that different nations have done in the Middle East and different people groups that have been killed, that have been massacred, that has led to an ongoing feud between different nations, whether it's India and Pakistan or basically Israel and most of the people around them, and certainly with our intervention in the Middle East as well. And so we need to understand that there's these larger perspectives of all the individuals, the people who are in the land where the battles are being fought, who are experiencing the impacts of the war and who are being killed, as well as the people who are the active fighters that are representing one side who may or may not disagree with the edicts of the leader that's making the calls of the war that's going to happen. Whose interests are they acting on behalf of? There's a lot of murky details and a lot of things that we can't know. And this is important for us to see that it's always been the case, whether it was the wars between the different European nations or the Crusades or in the Bible, as we mentioned, or even our common warfare. And what we want to take away from this as Christians is this understanding that we don't have while we have the command to go and subdue the land and take dominion and do it for the good of our neighbors, and we also have the mandate to defend our neighbors, we don't have the right to kill innocent people, particularly if they're acting in good faith or they're making treaties and covenants. And while there are large treaties and covenants happening between tribes and nations, or even the Americans and the British, and these covenants being violated, you have all of these smaller treaties and agreements that are happening just between individual groups of travelers. As we mentioned at the beginning of the book, there's a group of 10 Indians that have one white guy with them, and they successfully trade with the Great House Party, or with Kenton and the guys that he's with at the time. And so it's important to note that what we're getting out of this book is an understanding of who these characters are and what makes them good people based on their integrity. And as individuals, that's all we have control over, or not just as individuals, but as smaller groups. So the men in our brotherhood, guys in a particular area, men of the same church community, or even men who are in our military who have a particular unit. If we think about this rescue that just happened over Easter or not the pilot, the weapons operator of the F-15, and all of the different guys who had to put their life on the line and go in and find this man, the operators on the ground who actually rescued him, to the guys who are putting the plan together. And ultimately, through all of this, we have to acknowledge that God is sovereign. He's the one that's determining who's going to live and who's going to die. And at the same time, we have good characters like Simon who are brave and who are doing acts of valor, or George Rogers Clark in this story, that are going to save the lives of some and lead to their success. And then you have other characters who are duplicitous, like Lord Dunmore and the Great House Party, who kill people. And so that's going to happen throughout this book. And those are the types of things that we're going to talk about in our discussion. I think it gives us a lot of encouragement in how we analyze the things that are going on in our time. And we have to remember that God is sovereign. We need to be praying for righteous men to be the ones that are making the decisions on the ground that are affecting our nation as a whole. This war is affecting our everyday lives as Americans through the cost of gasoline and the cost of fuel. And if you're like me and you have a family member that's in the military, their life is on the line. And so we need to be praying, and we need to make sure that in our dealings, as far as it depends on us, whether you're a local militiaman, so to speak, kind of like Titus and some of his guys, that's certainly an aspect of our fraternity that we want to encourage. And that whether you're part of your church security team or you're defending your own family, you need to have a plan in place to defend your people. And you need to be the type of man who is capable of violence and is also capable of discernment and making good decisions, who's going to quell wickedness, even if it comes from within your own ranks. And that's a really important thing that I think Christians are continuously hard pressed to learn, is that we often have to stand against people who are going to be lie and be devious on our side. And that only is going to, God doesn't operate that way. That's only going to lead to more problems if we end up acting the same way. And throughout the course of this book, we're going to see that the Indians, because they refuse to let go of their devious dealings and their pagan ways of life, that the Lord is going to slowly deliver them over to the conquerors of this wilderness war. So that's the end of our chapter 2 summary. Titus, do you have a charge that you want to lead us with?
As we go out into our lives, we need to remember that, like Cam was saying, not everybody around us is going to be a pure actor. Not everybody around us is going to have our best interests at heart. We need to do what we can to learn these same lessons that Simon learns here, to trust your senses and to really be discerning about the people that you interact with, the people who are going to be in your circle. Be discerning about these things, but also don't be too risk adverse. Take a little bit of risk, put yourself out there, and do what God is leading you to do, whether it be starting a business, doing something new with your family, with your church. None of the things that happened on this frontier were done by men who kept that all safe while they did what they did. They took tremendous risk themselves, their lives, their reputation, all kinds of things. They risked the most horrible deaths imaginable because they believed in something. And there was other people out there that were opportunists that sought to do harm by them, to make a quick buck, to get what they wanted by doing them dirty as well. But recognizing those people are out there, being discerning, taking wisdom from people who are wiser than you, who have been there and have done that, and not fearing the possibility of failure is how we're going to continue to build Christendom, take dominion in every sphere of our lives, ultimately bring glory to God.
All right. Thanks for joining us on Chapter 2 of the Frontiersmen. We'll see you on the next episode.